have Nick Saunders joining us, who's going to be talking, as you can see from his slide, about how he's used newspapers for local history purposes. A bit of background: Nick was a policeman with Hampshire Constabulary, and when he retired he decided to do this history stuff properly and went off and did an open history degree and has subsequently done an MA, again from the Open University, I think, Nick, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I'm
still plodding through the MA at the moment.
And his particular interest, not surprising to us for having had that little introduction, is that he's a great interest in poverty and crime, and a lot of that we will hear he's picked up from the newspapers. He's based in New Milton, so that's his particular sort of geographical basis within Hampshire. But he also spreads himself a bit more widely than that, because he's also about a World War One, World War Two, just World War One, Nick.
World War One and Two battlefield guide.
Battlefield guide. When I saw that, of course, that's a big brief to do both World Wars. But you clearly have, got a vast amount of information about all of those things. So without further ado, let's move on and ask Nick to present his talk this evening. And welcome, Nick, and thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. My presentation this evening, well, first of all, I need to say to you that I've written this talk for you, for this society tonight, so I've not given it before, and I'm kind of hoping it's going to be about the 45-minute to 50-minute mark. If it starts getting light, though, I will know it's time to shut up. My presentation this evening will discuss the reasons why we should use newspapers, both national and local, in our local history research. I'll point out some of the pitfalls to be aware of when using the papers. Once you're aware of them, you'll know that it's still absolutely possible to use the papers and uncover some really good research material. I'll then take you through the uses that can be made of the various sections of the newspapers, and I'll give you some idea of where you can access the papers. We'll then discuss search techniques both online and in an archive, and I'll conclude the talk with a case study of some research I've carried out into an incident that took place in 1825 in Hampshire. So, why should we use newspapers for historical research? The quality press has not been called the first rough draft of history for nothing. That is very true. Newspapers may be the only source that are available to us if the official records have been lost or are unavailable to us. They may still be withheld. They may provide the only source of a photograph of an event or a person. One of my local history jobs, I'm the historian for the New Forest Show. And when I took the job on, I was asked to pin down the exact date of the very first New Forest Show. And I was only able to do that through local newspaper research and find out that it happened in July 1921. So they are primary sources. They're often a contemporaneous source, giving us some idea of the current thinking at that time, depending, of course, on the bias of the newspaper. They might reveal how ordinary people were affected by events, both local and national. And this is not something that we would necessarily get from reading a secondary source, a history book. The newspapers will give us some idea of what was considered a hot topic at that time. What was so important back in the 1920s or the 1910s? So the newspaper reports are a clue for us historians as to what everyone was getting worked up over at that time. What were the population, both national and local, focusing on? For example, what do the newspapers record as the election promises made during a campaign? Was it to keep and preserve the empire forever and a day, or was it to increase wages? Something more local. It gives us also some idea of the language and rhetoric being used at the time. The newspapers may give us some idea as to how much information was given to people at the time of the story, which we can compare and contrast with what we know today. But we should bear in mind that wartime editions were censored. And it might be that the first published account of an incident may not contain the full facts, simply because the journalist didn't know them. Newspapers can lead us into other areas of research. People and places are named in reports, and there may be references to other events linked to the incident that we can go and look at. The newspapers are a source that can be cross-referenced with other news reports to see what variations have been published. If a number of newspapers report the same facts, this gives some credibility to the published story. If the newspaper is reporting an incident on that day or the previous day, the immediacy of it could mean that the events are fresh in the reporter's mind. There's been no time for hindsight to set in or for pressure to be brought to omit or add to the story. The newspapers can provide us with a wealth of detail that might not be available anywhere else. For example, a person's address or their occupation, all human interest stuff. It might show the person's character. It might show, for example, in a court report, we might get an account of the person's previous convictions. It might tell us how a community reacted to an event. And in that respect, as historians, we are starting to see history through another person's eyes. It's worth researching both national and local papers for local stories. I'm currently researching the Indian Army in the New Forest in World War I, specifically the Indian Army hospitals. And I found some really useful research material in the Times and the Telegraph directly linked to my research topic. For example, the King and Queen visited Indian soldiers in Brockenhurst on the 17th of November 1914. That's reported in the Times. Both the Times and the Telegraph report that the Indian Soldiers Comfort Fund gave money to help set up a hospital for Indians in Brockenhurst. This really is the basis of good original local research, and I'll give you some examples of that later. As newspapers are dated, we can pin an incident down to a specific date or date period. When did a piece of legislation, national or local, come into force? Later editions of the paper may then tell us of the effect that this has on ordinary people, such as rationing or the blackout. In some of the early newspapers, parliamentary debates were often reported in such detail that it might not be necessary to use Hansard. Court cases are often recorded in the papers almost as a verbatim account of what was said in court, and both in terms of questions asked and the answers given. And I'm going to show you an example of that later. It's possible to follow a line of historical research through the newspapers. For example, crime in Victorian Hampshire. How was it reported? Was the fear of crime greater than the reality? What crime figures are reported each quarter in the Chief Constable's reports published in the Hampshire newspapers? How do they differ from what's published by the Home Office from 1856 onwards? A note of caution though, as good historians, you know that you've got to critically look at your primary and secondary sources. Who wrote it? When was it written? Who was the intended audience? What was the purpose of the document? Well, we're unlikely to identify an individual reporter unless they were famous in their day. However, we must remember that the newspapers were sources that were, on the whole, created by a literate elite and need to be reviewed critically if we are to discover genuine popular experience or opinions. What is the bias or leaning of the newspaper? Are they linked to a political party? Who was the owner of the paper? Was the newspaper promoting an agenda of the editor or the paper's owners? So it's worth trying to compare accounts of incident stories published between different newspapers. You know that if you read about something in the Times and the Telegraph, you're going to get a different view of it in the Observer or the Guardian. Keep in mind there are two sides to every story. The Guardian ran an advert on TV in the 1980s, which was quite powerful. It showed a young man in a leather jacket, looking a bit thuggish, running across the road, deliberately barging into an elderly gent and knocking him to the ground. This looked like an assault. But viewed from another angle, you can see as the old man's walking down the road, some roof slates are starting to fall, and this young lad has run across the road and pushed the old man out of the way, preventing him from being seriously injured. The advert just went to show there are two sides to every story. So when was the article written? Is the newspaper a morning edition? They might be reporting on an event from the previous day. Make sure of your dates. If it's an evening edition, the report might be short on details, as the facts are not fully known. A weekly edition may have a fuller story, but lack the immediacy of the event. Sometimes with a weekly paper, the date of the event could be a bit confused, so you need to take care with that. So we should bear in mind the full facts are not necessarily recorded. The article may lack the accuracy of official sources as well. So it's worth comparing your newspaper archive find to official sources. Quite often you find newspapers cover the urban centres more than they cover the rural areas. You'll find that some stories are syndicated, and you'll find the exact same story reported in regional newspapers around the country. This might be to your advantage, actually. If you want an article out of a particular edition that is not available in the archive, you might find exactly the same story published in the newspaper that is in that archive. So what is the article not telling us? What information's missing? Why? Just remember that errors creep in. So the reporter phones in his story to the news desk and the person transcribing it makes an error. Or the editor decides that's too much copy for the space he's got available in the paper. So he chops out and reduces some of the word count. So some part of that story, perhaps putting a different slant on the account's been left out. That may be added in later editions. So it's worth looking through a number of publications after the event. So remember that newspapers were published to tell the news of the day, and we are using them for a different purpose as historians. And we may know more about the incident than was available at the time. And that might colour our opinion of the validity of the source. You might read the story and say, well, that's just not right. I know that's not right, but that might be what was known at the time. So what can we use the different parts of a newspaper for? Well, we've got the main news, other news, the editorial, investigations, births, marriages and deaths called circular, the letters, adverts and situations wanted, and sports reports. The main news story, the breaking news, the first account of an incident, not necessarily always on the front page. So here we have the declaration of war. This is the First World War being declared as reported by the Daily Express. Here is the First World War being declared by, as reported in the Limington and Southampton Chronicle. It's on page 6. And you really have to dig around to find it. Also on the same page is cattle auctions and other things. We do find out from the local paper how the war is affecting the local population. So on the right hand column you can see there the folly of hoarding. We've got reports elsewhere in the paper that when war was declared, people went out and started mass panic buying sugar and bacon and butter. Can you imagine people panic buying today? Well, they certainly did then, and actually that ties in with a nice bit of research that you can find in the Hampshire Records Office. A lady called Mrs. Robinson, her diary, her World War I diary is in there. Mrs. Robinson lived in Ashley in New Milton, and she reports on people panic buying. So that ties in very nicely with this newspaper report. We've got the editorial. I had to rummage around and I missed this, but the editorial, what the editor thinks of the start of the war. The editor's comment on the top news story is somewhere in the paper. I missed that. Oh, just need to. We're back. Yeah. So I missed that, and you know, it's buried away on page 4. Other news. Well, this is the Daily Graphic of February the 22nd, 1915, which tells us of a concert party coming to the Barton-on-Sea Indian Army convalescent depot to entertain the troops there. Great pictures, not much text, but it pins down an event that happened at Barton-on-Sea in my period of research that I'm looking at. It's given me some great pictures, and it's also given me some pointers as to where I can go and look further for information. Investigations. Some newspapers carried investigations. The Times broke the story of the Andover Poorhouse scandal in 1845 and reported in some detail what was going on there, including the parliamentary inquiry. This horrendous event in Andover was one of the poor law scandals that contributed to a change in attitude towards the poor. And how Colin McDougall, the man running the poorhouse there, wasn't prosecuted, I don't know. The Times was a strong campaigner against the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 and ran numerous stories highlighting the alleged cruelty of the administration of the Poor Law Act. Later historians have researched those stories and found that 1/3 of them are true, 1/3 of them are embellished, and 1/3 of them are completely false. Births, marriages and deaths, lovingly known as hatched, matched and dispatched. This is a real good source of information about individuals. We've got names, parents' names, family names, occupations are given. Death notices sometimes give a potted history of the subject. And frequently in World War I and II, the newspapers reporting the casualty death notices often accompanied the little bit of information with a photograph, albeit not particularly good. Again, this is from the Limington and Southampton Chronicle. Not very good, but that's the only picture I've got. So I'm going to go with it. I'm going to use it. The Court and Circular. We can gain local history information from the Court Circular. And here we can see a notice from November the 17th, 1914, on the left, telling us that the King visited the wounded Indian soldiers at Brockenhurst. On the right, the Court Circular tells us that wounded Indian officers gave an address to the King in Buckingham Palace, but it specifically states that those officers came from the convalescent depot at Barton-on-Sea. Well, now I've got names of officers who I've got a firm link to at Barton-on-Sea. I can take that research on further. Who are those officers? Are they in the army list? What was their career? Did they survive the war? So that gives me further lines of inquiry to progress my research. The letters page. We can learn a lot from letters, and here we see one of the many letters written by Richard Griffin, a poor law medical officer and one of the leading lights of the Southampton branch of the Charity Organisation Society. He stirred up feelings about poor law expenditure in Southampton by writing a string of letters in the local papers, including the weekly Hampshire Independent and the Hampshire Chronicle. Here he's highlighting that Southampton in 1874 was spending 9 shillings and 7pence per head of population on the poor, compared with a national average of 6 shillings and 6pence. The letters pages are used by people involved in events to put their side of the story if they feel that the previous edition has not been correctly recorded, or they want to put their side across. If you stumble across the letter first, you may well then be aware of that you'll have to backtrack to previous editions to see what the story was. It's through letters that sometimes stories are changed. I'd like to correct your article from the last edition. I was there and this is what I saw. Adverts. We can get local history information from adverts. The advert will tell us something about the period of the time. So this is the Limington and Southampton Chronicle. It's dated the 22nd of October 1914, and it's an advert for motorbus tours leaving the Angel Inn in Limington once a week to go to Bustard Camp on Salisbury Plain so that sightseers can go and look at the Indian soldiers. It also tells us that there's a daily motor bus leaving the Angel Inn to visit the Indian soldiers at Ashurst Camp. So from that advert, we now know where the Canadian and the Indian soldiers are based, and that they were some sort of a public spectacle, something worth going to look at. And that's reinforced by an article in the Times from a journalist who's done just this. And he files a story published on the 28th of October with the headline, "Indians in Camp, Picturesque Scenes in the New Forest, a gypsy-like spectacle." Adverts. You won't be able to read any of this, but I can tell you that every column there is an advertisement for servants wanted. So that is January the 19th, 1919. And what does that tell us about the time? This is just after the war. And we've got a broadsheet there with 7 columns of jobs available for servants. Well, I've actually used that. I was asked to research the history of a country house. And by doing a bit of research, I found that in that particular page, there were 2 adverts for a maid and a cook wanted at that country house that I was trying to find the history of. If we take that on further, we'll see whether these adverts were repeated. Does that mean that they were unable to get a cook and a maid? Or does it mean that they were unable to keep them? They had difficulty retaining staff. So is that a line of inquiry we want to go down? Sports reports. These are really useful for local historians, as you're in with a reasonable chance of obtaining a photo of the person you're researching. Sometimes, as in this case, there's a little bit about their background. I've often cropped people out of a sports report photo to help illustrate my research or article when this is the only photo I can find of them. So where can we access the newspapers? Well, the library, Hampshire Library Service, offer access to Find My Past, and they offer access to the British Newspaper Archive. Also available via your library card is something called Access to Research, which offers over 15 million academic titles for free for you to review and read. The Hampshire Library Service, on their website as of yesterday, they were saying that they hold copies of the Hampshire Chronicle from 1772 to date, the Hampshire Advertiser 1823 to 1900, the Hampshire Observer 1877 to 1957, an incomplete series of the Hampshire and Berkshire Gazette, the Salisbury and Winchester Journal 1778 to 1974. In terms of local papers, they hold the Andover Advertiser 1859 to 1987, the Basingstoke News 1903 to 1915, Henry's Winchester Journal 1746 to 1748, the Romsey Advertiser 1901 to 1951, Winchester Quarterly Records 1848 to 1866, the Winchester Echo 1889 to 2005, and the Winchester Extra 1995 to date. So there's quite a range of local papers and county-wide papers that are available to you there. Obviously, not every paper is available. You're still going to have to go to your local archive, and it's well worth investigating what your local museum or archive holds. So for me, the St Barb Museum in Limington is the only place I can go and find the Limington and Southampton Chronicle. Phoebe Merrick of the Romsey Local History Society tells us that that society has JPEGs of every page of the Romsey Advertiser from 1898 to 1951, and then PDFs, searchable PDFs to 1972. And I know that the Christchurch Historical Society have copies of some of the Christchurch Times up to about 1920, and others are then held in the Dorset Record Office. The London Gazette is worth looking at. That's freely available online, and that tells us about individuals. So in the London Gazette, you are likely to find information about officers that you are researching who were commissioned, posted to units, medals that were awarded for gallantry, promotions, retirements, not just officers, other ranks who gained medals for gallantry were also mentioned in the London Gazette. I warn you though, their search engine is fiendishly difficult to use, and you've got to have a lot of patience. The British Cartoon Archive is free to access and contains work from celebrated newspaper cartoonists such as David Lowe. Well, the bulk of the collection dates from the late 19th century onwards. Cartoons are in the main designed for amusement, for satire and comedy, but they can reveal social mores and public opinion in the way that they present their subjects, and might be good historical evidence. Find My Past membership does give you some access to the British Newspaper Archive, but it is the British Newspaper Archive that I use as my main source. It's got 300 years worth of newspapers from around the country. There is a fee to pay if you want to access this, but you can either pay annually or you can pay in short periods of time. Or you can look out for reduced price or free access deals on special occasions. Well, obviously the huge advantage of the British Newspaper Archive is that you can review and do your research from home at any time. So search techniques and tips. Be prepared, do a bit of background reading. Just make sure of spellings of names. Bear in mind that they will change. They might not be correctly spelt in an article, so might not necessarily show up in the search engine. That you spelt it right, the newspaper didn't. Try and get an understanding for the dates and the sequence of events you're researching. Sometimes names change, location names change, and sometimes newspapers or journal titles change. And finally, stay focused. This is my nemesis. When I get into the archive, I will be in the Limington archive on Thursday. I will be reviewing the Limington and Southampton Chronicle, and I know I will be sidetracked. I will find something jolly interesting, and I want to review that further. This isn't necessarily a problem when you're doing this in the British Newspaper Archive, but when you're on limited time in a physical archive, it will cause you problems. Some digital archives offer a basic search and an advanced search facility. So when using the basic search facility, I would suggest you use quotation marks to link 2 or 3 words together. For example, if I'm researching the New Forest show, if I put into the search engine New Forest show, it will throw up articles where the word new and forest and show may be in a single phrase together, or maybe individual words scattered around the article. If I put quotation marks around them, the search engine knows that I am looking for an article that contains new and forest and show together as a phrase. Some advanced searches use Boolean operators such as and to narrow in a search by linking 2 words together, or to broaden a search by offering alternative search words, and not to exclude a word or phrase from the search. For example, if I'm researching the Indian Army hospitals in the New Forest, I might say not Brighton, because I am only doing the Indian hospitals in the New Forest. There was a large hospital complex in Brighton. That's not part of my research. Consider using wildcards, the asterisks there. So instead of saying Indian, for example, put India asterisks. That will bring me back results on India, Indian, Indians, and a word afterwards. Be creative with the spelling of the names. Names might be shortened or spelt in an archaic way. So Thomas might be not spelt Thomas, but it might be THOS. Try not to use modern jargon or phrases. In simple terms, the First World War up to 1939 was referred to as the Great War, not World War One. So just be careful what phrases or words you start searching on. This is the advanced search page of the British Newspaper Archive. So you've got an option here to search all words. Sue, can you see my mouse cursor?
Yes.
Going across there? Yeah, okay. So you can put your phrase in, search all words. That's the equivalent of and. Some words, exclude words. So I don't want Brighton. I only want this exact phrase used. You can look at the publication place. I'm only interested in reports from Hampshire. I only want articles from the Hampshire Chronicle. For my Indian Army research, I'm only interested from the 1st of August 1914 to the 31st of December 1916. That's the time period that the 2 years that we know the Indians were there. And we can also pin down whether we want to look at advertisements or just the articles. So it's well worth having a rummage through the search engine. It gives you tips. It's worth looking at the search tips here for the British Newspaper Archive and go through it. Tells you what to avoid, tells you about quotation marks, which I've already mentioned, tells you about being creative with the names. So Elizabeth can be put in as Lizzie or Eliza. It tells us to search the whole country. Other advanced search options, the power search. So it goes through all of these words, some words without these words, and you can get a more powerful, more targeted search. We can put a date range in and an article type or tags. Do you want the front page articles only? And it gives you advice on searching for words and hyphens. So it is well worth going through their tips on the British Newspaper Archive to get the best out of your search. Otherwise, it can be a little bit frustrating. So we've put our search option in. In this case, I'm looking for the Reverend John Edward Kelsall, who was the vicar of New Milton during World War I. I put John Edward Kelsall in inverted commas, and here are my search results that have come back. And they are listed in order of relevance. It also allows me to tweak the date range so I can narrow my search returns back. It allows me to just take articles from a particular newspaper. I can even pin it down to a county. I'm only interested in articles relevant to John Edward Kelsall in Hampshire. Having selected that first article, what will happen is the newspaper or the reader will zoom in to that article and you will see it in fairly clear detail. You'll see it's highlighted John Edward Kelsall there. It also, at the top, gives me the name of the newspaper and the date and the page number. Now, these buttons here allow me to go to the previous page or the page after. When you do that, you actually, it then zooms out to the full page and you have to select what you want to look at. This little tab up here, if I click on that, that allows me to save that article into a search box on my personal file in the British Newspaper Archive. So you click on that and it says, do you want to save this search? I say yes, and I've now got a search set up for John Edward Kelsall, and I've got a file box for John Edward Kelsall named in there, and that pops in. This box then turns red. If in a couple of weeks' time I resume my search for articles about John Edward Kelsall, when I come across this one, it will be red. So I know I've looked at it already. Cuts down on time for you. Look down the bottom. I can either print that or I can download it. So if I download it, what will happen is I will get the whole page, and I then a little drop down menu will come here, and I can save that as a PDF. When you save as a PDF, my top tip to you is to name your files carefully, because I have fallen foul of this schoolboy error, and you end up with PDF1, PDF2, PDF3, and you've got to reopen them, go through them, and relocate your article. So I've got the date of the article, the edition, page 2, and then I've got column 3, so that at the bottom to help me relocate that article. And briefly, what is it? It's the appointment of J. Council.
He's saying make sure you've got that sort of information on it, otherwise you'll lose it.
I thought there was a button you pressed and you got it.
Okay.
It's that little.
If you end up in an archive reviewing newspapers on microfiche, you need to take a pad and pencil with you, take a memory stick with you as well, and you can save either as a JPEG or PDF on the memory stick. It's sometimes a bit like searching for a needle in a haystack, but when you're going through the microfiche, there isn't a search facility as such, just you reviewing it. What you find though is that you can zoom out of a page just enough so that you can read the headlines but not the text, and that allows you to skim read pages until you've got the page that, or something that you feel is of use to you. Then you zoom in and save as a PDF. Read the articles as well, just briefly skim read them. Does it say that there's further to our edition last week, further to our previous article, or see the letters column, see editorial? That they're signposting you to other sources of research. Going back to labelling your research work. On the 27th of April 1891, in the village of Hordle, which is between New Milton and Limington, John Edward Yules, a man with mental health issues, objected to the way the breakfast table was laid out. He shot his sister with a revolver, badly wounding her, and when their mother came to assist her, John Yules shot her dead. He then sat down at the piano and played music until the neighbouring doctor and a police sergeant came into the house and detained him. Well, in my research on this story, I've so far obtained 34 newspaper articles relating to the incident and the funeral of Mrs. Yules and the remanding in custody of John. And these are from all over the country, including Dundee, Birmingham, Bristol, and even as far as the Isle of Wight. I've got a further 17 newspaper reports of the trial at Winchester Assizes. And through experience, I've learned that I need to carefully annotate each file so that I don't overlook the research material when I come to write up the history of the event. So again, as with the JPEG, you can see here we've got the date, which I always write in 224 format, so there's no room for error. If I've got a single digit in a date, I know I've inadvertently left something out. Is it the 7th? Is it the 17th or 27th, for example? So I always put a date in 224. The newspaper heading, you will need the page number. If you publish your work, you'll need the page number for your footnotes. And the column is really just for my convenience to try and recover the article from a complete page. You'll come up with your own methods, but I do recommend you create a filing system that will help you in the long run when you come to review your research. Okay, let's go on to the case study then. This is a bill presented in 1825 by Dr. Goddard to the parish of Milton. And I found this bill whilst doing some research in the rectory at New Milton. So Mary Magdalene Rectory. There is the date, 1825. But the bit we're interested in is from here onwards, which I've enlarged for you. June the 4th, Journey in the Night, James Reed, medicine, ingredients for, I think that's formulations, Journey in the Day, cutting for extracting a ball, and attendance, and we've got Journey and attendance on the coroner on the 5th, and the 6th, Journey opening the body of James Reed, evidence before the jury, and expenses at Milton. So what's going on here then? Interesting. We need to research this further. So we've got a date. We know we've got Dr. Goddard, and we know that this is about James Reed, R-E-A-D-E. So let's start having a look in the papers. The Hampshire Chronicle of the 13th of June 1825 tells us that on Friday night, the 3rd inst, between the 11th and 12th, 11 and 12, a severe and unfortunate contest took place in Nash Field near Chewton Bunny, about 4 miles east of Christchurch. And we know it was Lieutenant Pullin, RN, commanding a group of men from the Hurst station, and he was up against a party of smugglers when the latter suffered most severely. A ball entered the abdomen of James Reed, a labourer of Mead's End near Milton, and terminated his existence after several hours of suffering. 2 other men are lying in a dangerous state. An inquest has been held at the Wheatsheaf public house in Milton on the body of Reed. Mr. Baldwin's the coroner, and the jury, after a long investigation, returned a verdict of willful murder against Lieutenant Pullin and William Young. Who's William Young? We don't know, but this needs further research. And we know that a smuggler's lugger made its appearance opposite Chewton Bunny whilst this was going on. So that's our first account that I found. Same date, different newspaper, Hampshire Telegraph and Sussex Chronicle, same date. Yesterday Sennight, between the hours of 11 and 12 o'clock. But if you read it, some of the language is the same. A ball entered the abdomen of James Reed, a labourer of Mead's End in Milton. The inquest has been held on the body of Reed before Mr. Baldwin. The foreman, we now learn, something new here, was Thomas Jones, Esquire, of Sway House. They return a verdict of willful murder. So this is corroborating the earlier research that we found. So there really is something in this story. Some of this looks quite useful. What we've now got a little bit further on is the Southampton and County Herald, 20th of June 1825, a fray at Christchurch. On Thursday last, James Pitman was brought before George Eyre, Esquire, one of the county magistrates, in the custody of several of the preventative guards. So James Pitman is one of the men involved in this incident. We've got a name of someone else. We can research that person, perhaps in the 1841 census or in the 1841 tithe map, if he is a local man. So what do we know is happening? We've got William Troth and William Williams, very original name by Mum. Both of them are customs men. So are they based at Hurst, or are they based at the customs house at Barton? And we now know that on the 3rd inst, these the persons disguised and armed assaulted and obstructed Lieutenant Pulling. So note that the name's changed. He's not Pullen, as the first report suggests. He's Pulling, and others known there to be officers of Her Majesty's Customs. Pitman was one of the smugglers. It cost James Reed his life. and we talk about the discharge of the pistol. Isaac Reed was brought up on similar information. But who's Isaac Reed? Is he a relative of James Reed? He was clearly down there on the beach or near to, and he was clearly involved. But what we find here is that the magistrate, on hearing the evidence, finds that there's not quite enough evidence to remand Isaac Reed in custody and finds him not guilty. But James Pitman is remanded. Southampton's Chronicle of the 20th of June, 1825, tells us a bit more about James Pitman. He's committed to Winchester Jail for having on the night of the 3rd inst with other persons to the number of 30 and upwards. So we've learned something new here. This gang of smugglers that the customs men were up against was at least 30 in number. They assaulted Lieutenant Pulling, we're confirming the name there, and some customs house officers in the discharge of their duty. Isaac Reed was charged with a similar offence, but he was discharged. So we've learned a little bit more there. The Hampshire Telegraph on the 18th of July tells us more, but some of this is confusing. In the first instance, it's signposting us as to where we can find more information in the newspaper. The following account of the trial at the Hampshire Assizes is a continuation from the preceding page. So if this is the first article I alight on in my research, I know to go back a page, read it carefully. Fatal affray with the smugglers at Forley in Hampshire. Really? Are we sure? James Pulling and William Young, the former a lieutenant in the Navy and the latter a seaman employed in the preventative service. So now we know who William Young is. Charged with having at the parish of Milton wilfully murdered James Reed. John Goddard, well, we know Mr. Goddard, we know Dr. Goddard. He started our inquiry off in that bill. Well, he's the Christchurch surgeon then, not the Milton parish surgeon. So he travelled over from Christchurch in the night to Milton, and he deposed that on the morning of the 4th of June, he was called to attend on the deceased. He found had been shot in the belly, just above the navel. And James Reed was in great pain. The witness extracted a leaden ball from the right buttock, soon after which he died of the wound. During his illness, the deceased told the witness on inquiries from him that it was a person by the name of Evans from the preventative service who'd shot him. This is what we would call a dying declaration. And he was positive of the man. He didn't think that aim was taken at him in particular. No goods were landed at the time, and that there was an assembly of about 60 persons. So now we know we've got the smugglers are about 60 in number. That's gone up from our earlier reports. Interestingly, James Reed reports here that he's owed 30 shillings for the last 7 nights' work. Well, in 1834, Edwin Chadwick, in his investigation into the administration of the Poor Law, wrote to every parish in the country and put 56 questions to them, one of which is, how much is a labourer paid in your parish? And in Milton parish, they answered 9 shillings in 1834. So here's James Reed for 7 nights' work, earning 30 shillings. This is lucrative work for a smuggler, especially being on the landing party. You imagine then you've got 60 men down on the beach as the landing party that are going to bring the tubs ashore and get them inland. Are they all earning that amount? There's a lot of money in smuggling here. We now read about Timothy Dawkins. So he's a witness, and he just happens to be out and about at 11 o'clock at night on the 3rd of June. He heard the report of pistols, which seemed to come from a place called Lobb's Hole. So Lobb's Hole is where the action's taking place, and I'm able to locate that on the 1841 tithe map. So he hastened that way, and the firing continued. He met a number of persons coming away. He met Lieutenant Pulling with 2 more persons, and Pulling ran up to him and said, "What are you up to here?" And someone replied, "We're not up to much." Pulling stopped and conversed with these men, and the party walked on. He soon, however, ran after them, he being Pulling, and seized on a man who was struggling when Pulling demanded, "Are you ready for we are?" No one made reply to this, and the prisoner stepped back and fired a pistol at the man. So this is Timothy Dawkins telling the jury how he witnessed the death of James Reed, or the mortal wounding of James Reed. Well, the Times on the 18th of July 1825 publishes a full account, and I really can't go into it all here for you, but I've extracted one or two bits of interest. So we're talking 2.5 columns in the Times report on this incident at Naish, Barton-on-Sea. There's a legal argument before the case even starts. There's an objection here. We find that counsel for the prosecution, counsel for the defence are arguing that Lieutenant Pulling and William Young have been incorrectly charged, and that they should have been charged with willfully, feloniously, and with malice aforethought did assault, rather than just simply he discharged a pistol against the body of the deceased and inflicted a mortal wound. So there's some considerable argument that this was done willfully, feloniously, and with malice aforethought. We hear again the evidence from Timothy Dawkins. Let's compare and contrast that against what we've read in the other newspaper. Is there anything different? Are there any changes there? And we've also got that from Dawkins that Williams, who's on trial, jumped in after the shooting and chopped with his cutlass after the second pistol was fired. So we find out a little bit more about it. Some of these witnesses are starting to backtrack a bit, and what is picked up in the Times report that's not visible on this screen grab is that some of the witnesses' evidence given in Winchester at the assizes does not match up with what they said in the coroner's court at Winchester, the coroner's court in Milton. Well, to everyone's surprise, the jury found Young not guilty, but Lieutenant Pulling was found guilty of manslaughter. The next news report I found was this one in the Hampshire Chronicle, 25th of July, 1825. This is the Limington and Southampton Chronicle, sorry. And it said, in our paper last week, we reported at some length the trial of Lieutenant Pulling, RN. Reading on further, we then find that the brother of Lieutenant Pulling, who is a vicar, it gets access to a letter which is written in the handwriting of one of the jurymen, and it is giving instructions to the witnesses on how to give their evidence. And it says that all of them were to give evidence to swear positively that they saw Lieutenant Pulling shoot Reed, giving them directions on how to conduct themselves in court. So Reverend Pulling produces this to the judge, and ultimately Lieutenant James Pulling is given a pardon for his conviction. However, if we continue to research either side of this article, of this incident, let's look at before the incident. And we see in the local papers that actually James Pulling of the preventative station at Hurst Castle is a zealous and conscientious officer, and does his duty and makes frequent seizures of contraband. And here we have again more reports in 1824. Got another report in the Hampshire Telegraph on the 21st of February 1825, the year of our incident. Remember, the incident took place in June. There's an account being printed by order of the House of Commons. Basically, the House of Commons had an inquiry into the preventative service and how much was this costing the revenue, the exchequer. Was preventing smuggling costing more money than the goods seized. So now I know of a primary source that I can go and get from parliamentary papers online, which will give me good information to help in my line of research for this local history story. And finally, the London Gazette in 1863 reports that Captain James Pulling has been promoted to be Rear Admiral on the terms proposed in the London Gazette of the 1st of September 1846. So getting had up on a charge of murder and getting a pardon didn't do James Pulling's career any harm. He made it to the rank of captain and was eventually promoted Rear Admiral. And there are other lines of research there that can help us find more about James Pulling. So local newspapers and national newspaper research absolutely made this local history story. It gave me a great deal of information about the incident. It gave me the locations, the times. It's given me about 10 names of locals that I can investigate further and try and find more about them. It's given me an insight into the smuggling that was taking place at that time on the coast. And it's given us the voices of some of the participants as heard in court. I hope now that you'll agree that researching the newspapers is absolutely essential for local historians, and that newspapers really are the first draft of history. Thank you for watching.
There's a question for you, Nick, about the British Newspaper Archive, asking, does it differ from the archives of newspapers that are found in Find My Past?
I think in Find My Past, you get less access when you sign in when you buy into British Newspaper Archive. There is more available to you, and I'm basing this on at the moment I'm plodding through this master's degree with the Open University. Through the Open University library, I can get a freebie access to Find My Past, and I've noticed that the British Newspaper Archive there is somewhat more restricted. That's just what I've found as a result of using Find My Past through the OU library.
Thank you, Nick. So there are a few observations about the Find My Past newspaper collection and how to use it to best advantage, but I won't take those just now. I'll come back to them if there are no further questions that come in our remaining 10 minutes or so. There's an observation. Yes,
I
sorry,
just
Roger.
make a point. I started subscribing to the British Newspaper Archive at the beginning of the pandemic, just as a little treat. It's costing me £12.95 a month, but warned, once you sign up, it's very difficult to unsign.
Oh, right.
You get addicted to it. I would certainly.
It's not difficult to take yourself out, but it's difficult to keep it up, is it? I see, right.
But I would
Roger, would you say you're getting your £12 worth each month? Are you getting value for money?
Not every month.
Okay.
Some months it's more busy than others, but it's very nice to know I can always get. It's always there at my fingertips. Whereas previously I had to go into, I live in Southampton, and we were able to access it through the local library in Southampton. So it was a bit of a long-winded way round then. But I would certainly echo everything you've said, Nick, about the archive.
The other point about the British Newspaper Archive is that local newspapers are being added all the time. The Limington Times and New Milton Advertiser was bought out a couple of years ago, and Charles Curry, the long-time editor there, was very kind in allowing me to go to the newspaper offices and look at the original bound editions. When the newspaper was bought, it was bought by a chain, and they took those newspapers away. And I was somewhat dismayed, thinking we'd never see them again. And I was delighted in my research the other day to find that 1928 to 1938 of the New Milton Advertiser and Limington Times is now on the British Newspaper Archive, as are some editions from the 1990s. So I think they're doing them in blocks. and clearly you have to keep looking, keep an eye on what new additions are going in.
Yes, yes. As
I
you
have
say,
a-
that added
Sorry.
to all the time.
I have a question here, which I think this may or may not reflect what you two were just discussing. It's a question about how much local newspapers are of a local nature. The observation is that the Eastleigh District Local History Society has made use of the Eastleigh Weekly News, especially in the first part of the 20th century. It says that only 2 of 8 pages are of local news, with 4 pages of national news and 2 of adverts. It says very few pictures are of local news. Is that a typical example?
I think it depends from edition to edition, and also I guess for the Victorian and Edwardian ones, I think some of the news was syndicated around, so stories were sold to other local newspapers. And going back to that murder in Hordle, that murder is reported in the local newspaper in Aberdeen. It's reported in Birmingham. It's reported elsewhere in Bristol, throughout the country. Historians in Bristol and Aberdeen might be saying, why on earth have we got a murder story in the 1890 edition of our paper, something that's at the other end of the country? Interestingly, those stories in those newspapers are exactly the same wording.
Yeah, I was just going to say that some of those examples you showed us, they obviously, whole paragraphs look to have been sort of replicated.
Could I just make the point about national news in local newspapers? From my experience, it reduces as the years go by. Back in the mid-19th century, I would agree with what the Eastleigh contribution said, that a lot of the paper was taken up with national news, but over the years that has tended to decline, and so I think when you get into the 20th century, I think you find that a much more copy in the local newspaper is local news.
Okay, thank you. Another question, please. Are all papers in the British Newspaper Archive digitally searchable?
Yes.
Thank you. That's very sharp and to the point.
There was a question there I saw about legibility. How legible are they?
Right.
Well, that varies. The legibility is questionable. However, if it's poor in one edition, it might pay you to look in another edition from the same date. You may get a better copy in another newspaper. Just to answer Chris Humby's question, yes, Chris, I'm very sorry, I forgot to say that one of the benefits of the Hampshire Library Service is you can access the British Newspaper Archive online or via your library card for free. So you can do that still via your Hampshire library card.
You'd have to go. Sorry, you'd have to go into a library to access it. You couldn't access it from home. If it's the same arrangement as we had in Southampton, you can only access the British Newspaper Archive in the library or a library. You can't access it from home, but it may be different in Hampshire.
Okay. Chris Humby wants to come back on that one.
Nick, some years ago, I used the newspaper archives quite extensively. Very powerful information, very useful information. But when I've tried recently, I can get into the archives, but if I want to copy anything, apparently I can get 3 for free, but I then have to pay. I just wonder what happened. Does anybody know why the system was changed?
To be honest, I don't know. When I was doing a bit of research for this talk, I went into my local library in New Milton and spoke to them there, and and they implied to me that it was free access to you. And I did ask about downloading, because I would be, if I was using the library, I'd be tempted to take in my memory stick and save the article that I found on the newspaper archive onto my memory stick. I'm uncertain why it's limiting you to 3, and then you'd have to pay. That's something perhaps you might want to take up with the library service, and they may be able to offer you advice on a way round it. The other thing, Chris, do you remember we used to be able to get the Times in the library as well? You used to get the Times archive in the library, and I understand from Hampshire Library Service that it stopped. They stopped paying the subscription for it because it just simply wasn't being used. So that's something we've lost through lack of use.
Okay. The observation that's come in is from someone who says they represent the Mothers' Union in Winchester Diocese. They find the newspaper archive in Hampshire Record Office of great assistance in identifying leaders, events and celebrations, but somewhat sadly early editions do not include any photographs. Do you find, I mean, this is my question, not this person's, but do you find that there are, as you come through the 19th century, you start to get more illustrations in your newspapers? Absolutely, yes. Yeah, you do. And not only that, the quality of them improves as well. Going back to the research I was doing for the New Forest show to try and identify the date of the very first show, that 1921 newspaper, the images are very poor, but they're the only photos I've got of the New Forest show in 1921. So I'll go with what I've been given. However, although the photos are poor, the text that goes with it, the copy that goes with it, is excellent. We get quite a vivid description of the show. So I guess I would be happy to trade off the poor photos against a good description and putting names to winners and names to the president and who the committee are. I learned a lot from that first report that helped my local history research. We have I will hand over to Roger to give thanks to Nick for his really fascinating talk this evening. I'm sure everybody has enjoyed it. We reached about 50 participants, by the way, so you
it's very good.
Everybody stayed to the end, I think, just about, although a few have drifted away during questions. So Roger, to you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Nick. That was absolutely brilliant, and I'm sure even those of us who use newspapers a lot learn quite a lot from your talk. The case study was very engaging and very thought-provoking. What I would say is that when these sessions end, you suddenly think, why didn't I ask that? Why didn't I ask? So if anybody has any questions that have come up on reflection, then if they either email myself or Barry Sherlock, then we'll pass those, if they're questions, we'll pass them on to Nick, and then Nick can reply to you. So don't think this is the last word. By all means, keep the debate going if you have any thoughts that occur after the session ends. Thanks once again, Nick, for your time and the research that you did to put it into your presentation. And we look forward to maybe hearing from you again on some future occasion.